Welcome to Heart Over Gold, the channel where love, kindness, and humanity shine brighter than any fortune. In today's story, To the World, Elara was forgotten, a woman left behind in the shadows of fame and wealth after her husband's cruel betrayal. But tonight, under the shimmer of chandeliers and the glare of flashing cameras, everything changed. She stepped onto the red carpet not as the woman who was mocked, but as the woman they could no longer ignore. And when the crowd turned, even he was speechless. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments, and keep up with our latest stories. He was once the center of every room he entered. Ethan Blackwell, CEO, millionaire, admired by the world. He walked with the confidence of a man who believed nothing could touch him. People laughed at his jokes even when they weren't funny, nodded at his opinions without challenge. To everyone else, he was brilliant, powerful, magnetic. To Elara, he had once been home. When they married, she believed in love with all her heart. She gave up her small art studio and her city apartment to move into his glass mansion in the hills. She adjusted to the luxury, the attention, the cold walls and high ceilings, but slowly, she also adjusted to the silences, the dismissive glances, and the way Ethan always seemed to be speaking over her, horror through her but never to her. He never raised his voice. His cruelty was subtle, wrapped in polished sentences and false smiles. When she spoke at dinners, he corrected her. When she wore something she liked, he'd say, "That's bold for someone your age." When she suggested helping with the business, he smiled like she was a child pretending to be grown. Elara, full of softness and art, began to shrink. She started to doubt her ideas, then her talent, then herself. Her brushes collected dust. Her laughter faded. The woman who once danced in the kitchen with paint on her hands became someone quiet, careful, invisible. She stayed because she believed love meant patience. She stayed because she thought maybe, one day, he'd see her again. But years passed, and the man who had once held her with such care now treated her like decoration. And when he started telling people at parties that she used to be an artist, she felt something inside her quietly break. The final straw came one evening, just before the biggest event of his career, a celebrity charity gala he'd been planning for months. She stood in the closet, holding a gown she hadn't worn in years. She smiled nervously and asked him, "Do you think this still looks good on me?" He barely looked up from his phone. "It's fine, just try not to draw too much attention. This night isn't about you." She didn't cry, not then. She simply nodded and walked away, her heart heavy, her silence louder than ever. That night she didn't go to the gala. She sat alone in her studio, the one room Ethan never bothered to enter, and stared at a blank canvas. She touched a brush again for the first time in years, and it felt like holding the hand of an old friend. She didn't know what to paint. She just knew she had to begin. Something soft, something real, something hers. In the weeks that followed, Elara began to rediscover herself. She reached out to her childhood best friend Lily, now a rising fashion designer, who immediately invited her to stay for a while at her home in the countryside. Lily saw what Ethan never did: Elara's quiet brilliance, her compassion, her light. Under Lily's roof, Elara painted again, took long walks, read books, and laughed the way she hadn't in years. She found joy in simple things: tea under the stars, sketching in the early morning light, letting the wind touch her face without feeling watched. Kindness slowly stitched her back together. Lily helped her design a look for the next charity gala, this one even bigger than the last. "You're going," Lily said with a playful smile. "But not for him. For you." Elara wasn't sure she was ready to face Ethan again. But she also knew she wasn't afraid anymore. She had no intention of revenge, no plan to make a scene. She simply wanted to show up as the woman she truly wasn't, see what it felt like to be seen. When the night arrived, the ballroom glittered with lights and celebrities and reporters. Ethan, as usual, was in the center of it all, smiling like a man who owned the world. Then the room shifted. Gasps rippled through the crowd as Elara entered. She wore an emerald gown that hugged her with grace, her hair falling in soft waves, her eyes shining not with revenge but with peace. She didn't strut. She didn't try to command attention, but all eyes found her anyway. The cameras flashed, people whispered, "Elara Blackwell." She didn't look for Ethan. She didn't need to. His stare was burning across the room, full of disbelief. She walked past him with a kind smile, not spiteful, not smug, just whole. She spent the evening talking to artists, volunteers, and guests. She smiled easily, laughed softly. When a journalist asked her how she felt coming back into the spotlight, she said, "I'm just here to support something meaningful. I used to live in the shadows, but the light feels good." Later, Ethan approached her. He looked polished, but unsettled. "You look different," he said. She met his eyes gently. "I'm just more myself now." He searched for words, something clever or apologetic, but Alara didn't wait for them. She didn't need anything from him, not praise, not closure, not permission. She simply excused herself to return to a conversation about an art grant. For young women, that night she didn't steal the spotlight, she became it. Weeks later, she opened her own studio. Not a gallery, not a business empire, just a small, sun-filled space for women like her, women who needed to remember themselves. She taught art, hosted healing circles, and offered gentle kindness to those who walked through her door. She never spoke badly of Ethan when asked about her past. She'd simply say, "Sometimes, love teaches us who we are, and sometimes, it teaches us who we are not." She moved forward with compassion. For herself, for others, even, quietly, for him, because Ilara had learned something powerful. True strength isn't about making someone regret hurting you. It's about healing so deeply that they no longer have the power to, and in the softest, kindest way possible. Blackwell became unforgettable. Ilara's studio by the sea, the lighthouse, became more than a place for art. It became a haven for women who had forgotten their voices. Some came with bruised hearts, others with broken dreams. Many had never picked up a paintbrush before, but Alara didn't teach perfection, she taught presence. Each canvas was an invitation. Paint what you feel, not what you're told. In that little studio, stories unfolded in soft colors. A widowed mother painted her grief in shades of gray and blue. A teenager filled a wall with oranges and reds to express the rage she was never allowed to speak. A retired nurse painted flowers, blooming from cracked ground. Elara offered tea, gentle guidance, and space. No judgment, no pressure, just warmth. People began calling her the woman who listens. Some even called her the healer who doesn't wear a stethoscope. One rainy afternoon, as she was cleaning brushes and humming softly, a knock echoed at the door. She wasn't expecting anyone. Classes were over for the day. She opened the door and met a pair of gentle, uncertain eyes. "Hi," he said, holding a slightly damp notebook to his chest. I heard you teach painting." "I'm not an artist. I'm a writer. Well, I used to be, but I'm stuck. I thought maybe, I don't know, colors might help." He smiled shyly, rain dripping from his coat. His name was Caleb. He had once written short stories for a living gentle, lyrical tales of people finding meaning in small moments. But a sudden loss had left him hollow. His words had dried up. His world had grown quiet. Alara looked at him for a long moment, then opened the door wider. "You don't need to know how to paint," she said softly. "Just bring your heart." Caleb began coming once a week. He was quiet at first, often painting in silence while soft music played in the background. His brushstrokes were clumsy, his lines uncertain, but there was sincerity in every color he touched. One evening, as the sun melted into the ocean, he looked up from his canvas and said, "You know, I used to write about women like you." Ella smiled gently. "Women like me, kind, brave, the kind that rise quietly instead of burning everything down. I just didn't know they existed outside of fiction." She felt her heart stir, not with excitement but with recognition. That feeling of being seen, not for beauty or perfection, but for essence. She didn't rush into anything, neither did he. They shared slow moments, walks along the shore, conversations about stories, about healing, about silence. He never asked about Ethan. She never asked about his grief. They both understood that some wounds didn't need words, only time and kindness. Meanwhile, across the city, Ethan's world had started to crumble, not in a dramatic collapse, but a slow, cold unraveling. The people who once praised him began pulling away. A charm that had once impressed now seemed shallow. Investors grew cautious. Friends turned polite. And when people spoke of the Blackwells, it was no longer his name they admired. It was hers. He watched her from afar, her face appearing in art magazines, her words quoted in blogs about healing and reinvention. She was invited to speak at women's circles, community events, even schools. Not once did she speak of him, and somehow that silence hurt more than anger ever could. One day he drove past her studio. He sat in his car and watched from across the street. Children were painting rainbows on the windows. A group of women laughed as they loaded paintings into a van. And Alara stood among them, not like a leader, but like someone who belonged. She looked full of life, and he had never felt so far away from it. Back at the studio, Caleb brought her a gift, a small, leather-bound notebook with blank pages. "I thought maybe it's time you write," he said. "Your voice deserves to live." On paper, too, Elara touched the cover gently. For years she had only created with her hands, but now, something inside her said it was time to speak, to share her story. Not for pity, but for strength. That night, by candlelight, she wrote her first entry. There was a time I thought kindness made me weak, that staying quiet was safer than standing tall. But I see now softness is not weakness. Love is not loss, and compassion is the loudest way to say, you didn't break me. Seasons changed. The studio walls were now covered in paintings, bold, messy, beautiful. The town held an art fair in her honor. Children sang her name like a song, and Caleb, steady, warm Caleb, stood beside her, never trying to outshine her, only lighting her path when it grew dark. Elara no longer lived for someone else's approval. She didn't seek revenge. She didn't crave recognition. She lived for joy, for color, for every woman who ever felt small, and in the quiet, steady way she had always loved Elara, built a life that even the brightest spotlight couldn't outshine, because she stole it, but because she finally knew she was worthy of it all along. The air grew colder as autumn arrived. Leaves scattered like gold along the quiet streets near Elara's studio. The sea turned silver, restless with wind. Tourists faded with the season, but the lighthouse stayed warm, full of stories and soft light. Inside, candles flickered on windowsills, and laughter echoed against painted walls. Elara was no longer a mystery in the town, she was part of it. Every Saturday she hosted a circle of silence, an open hour where anyone could come, sit on the floor, and create without words. Some cried while painting, some sat in stillness. No one judged. There were no critiques, no corrections, only compassion. Caleb came often. He didn't always paint anymore sometimes. He just listened, wrote, or sat beside Elara in quiet solidarity. They never rushed their closeness. There were no dramatic declarations, just small, meaningful gestures. Tea made without asking, a scarf tucked around her shoulders on windy days, hands brushing briefly as they passed a canvas between them. One evening, after everyone had gone, and the studio was bathed in the soft glow of table lamps, Caleb walked toward her with a small package in hand. "You remember that story I told you I couldn't finish?" he said, voice low. She looked up from her painting. "The one you started before the grief." He nodded. "I finished it, because of you." He handed her the printed pages, bound with a single ribbon. She untied it gently, flipping through words that were raw and honest, full of hope. The story was about a woman who had been dimmed by someone else's shadow, and how she built her own sun. She looked at him, eyes glistening. "This is beautiful." He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. They both knew. By winter, something new began to bloom in Elaron. The rush of infatuation, but the quiet certainty that she was safe. With Caleb, there was no pretending, no walking on glass, no bracing for the next careless word. There was room for her to speak, to feel, to be. But even with warmth surrounding her, some nights still felt cold. Healing wasn't a straight path. There were days she missed the life she once imagined with Ether, not because she wanted it back, but because grief is strange like that. You don't just mourn people, you mourn the version of yourself that loved them, even when you were hurting. Caleb never pushed. He never tried to fill space that wasn't his. Instead, he left soft reminders that she wasn't alone, a hand resting near hers, a note left on her easel. "You're allowed to take your time, I'll still be here." She had never known love could be so kind. Meanwhile, Ethan faded further into the background of her story. Word traveled that he'd been replaced as CEO after a scandal involving business ethics. The world that once clung to him moved on, fast and without sentiment. One day, a letter arrived at the lighthouse. No return address. Elara knew the handwriting. Immediately, it read, "I thought winning meant having everything, but I lost you, and now I realize, you were everything. I'm sorry for all of it." She read it twice, folded it, then placed it gently into the bottom drawer of her desk, not out of hate but because it didn't belong in the life she had now. She whispered, "I forgive you," into the quiet room. And then she moved on. Spring returned. The studio blossomed. Again, this time with more students, more stories, and more joy. Elara hosted her first art exhibit featuring pieces from every woman who had walked through her doors. The local paper called it a gallery of healing. The mayor attended, so did former students, travelers, neighbors, and even strangers who had followed her journey online. As Elara stood at the entrance, greeting guests, Caleb approached her in a soft gray suit. His hands were tucked in his pockets, his eyes warm and steady. "I've never seen you shine like this," he said, quietly. She smiled, heart full. "I've never felt like this before." He held her hand, not possessively, not as a claim, but as a promise. And as the room filled with applause, cameras, and chatter, Alara leaned close and whispered in his ear, "This is the only spotlight I've ever wanted, one that feels like home." And so her story unfolded not as a tale of revenge, but of rebirth. She became the woman who rose with love, who chose compassion over bitterness, who taught others that healing isn't loud but it is powerful. Alara didn't just survive, she blossomed, and the world finally saw her not through the shadow of a man who couldn't love her well, but through the light of a woman who learned to love herself fully, and that light never faded again. Spring melted into early summer. The studio thrived. Alara was now hosting retreats by the ocean, weekends of healing, painting, storytelling. Caleb stood by her side quietly, lovingly, never overbearing. They weren't rushed by titles or timelines, they lived in trust, not urgency. It felt steady, safe, right. One evening after the last retreat guest had gone home, Alara sat on the porch with Caleb, watching the tide come in. "I think I'm happy," she said softly. He looked at her, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "You are happy?" She nodded, leaning into him. "It still surprises me. I used to think the only way I could be strong was by hardening, but I didn't have to become cold. I just had to stop breaking for people who didn't know how to hold me." Caleb kissed her forehead. "Your warmth, Alara, that's your strength." They stayed like that, under the stars, thinking the hardest part of her story was behind them. But life, as it often does, had one more page to turn. It began with a letter, an elegant envelope hand-delivered by a courier to her studio one Tuesday morning. No return address again, but this time, it wasn't from Ethan. Inside a note, brief, formal, and shocking. To Ilara Blackwell, "I believe I may be your sister. My name is Amelia Laurent. I was adopted in 1989 and recently uncovered documents during a search for my birth family. Your name was listed on a connection sheet. I believe we share the same mother. Please know I do not wish to disrupt your life, but I've spent years searching for pieces of myself. You may be one." With hope and care, Amelia Laura's hands shook her sister. She had always believed she was an only child. Her parents had passed away years ago, and they never mentioned another child, certainly not one given away. She sat on the edge of her desk, heart racing. The memories came back slowly, her mother's long silences, the one room in their old home she was never allowed to enter, the way her father changed the subject whenever she asked about his early years with her mother. Could it be true? Caleb arrived at the studio later that afternoon, finding her lost in thought. The letter open beside her. "What is it?" he asked gently. She handed him the letter. He read it carefully, then looked at her with soft, steady eyes. "What do you want to do?" "I don't know," she whispered. "What if it's real? What if my entire life has been missing someone I was never told about?" He reached for her hand. "Then maybe this is another door opening, not for answers, but for healing." She nodded, unsure, afraid, but curious. Alara met Amelia 2 weeks later at a small cafe near the coast. Amelia was nothing like her physical, taller, with auburn curls and a French accent, softened by years abroad. But her eyes, those were the same, deep, quiet, kind. They looked at each other like mirrors that had just been dusted off. "I wasn't sure you'd come," Amelia said, fiddling with a charm bracelet. "I almost didn't," Alara admitted. "But something in your letter, it felt honest." Over coffee, Amelia explained everything, that she had been born when their mother was still very young before she met Alara's father. With no family support and no income, she was forced to give the baby up. Amelia was adopted by a couple in France, grew up loved, but always felt something missing. "When I turned 35, she said, "I started searching, just for truth. I didn't expect to find you." Alara felt tears rising in her chest. She reached across the table and took Amelia's hand. "I didn't know, but I'm glad you found me." Weeks turned into months. The two women began to bond. Slowly, visits, letters, childhood stories, matching memories of lullabies only her rumor bed. Amelia was quiet, like Alara, but bold in her own way. She had traveled the world, painted in markets across Europe, spoken 4 languages, and loved fiercely. They were opposites, and yet the same. Caleb watched their bond grow with gentle encouragement. "Maybe this is the part of your story that helps complete you," he said one night, as Alara shared photos from her childhood with Amelia. "Not because it explains everything, but because it gives you something back you didn't even know was missing." Alara nodded, touched by the unexpected gift life had handed her. But just when things settled again, the second twist arrived. Amelia came to the studio one rainy evening, her face pale. She held a folder in her hands. "I found something else," she said, her voice tight. Inside the folder were copies of old letters written by Alara's mother, to Ethan. And at the bottom, a signed document. An agreement, quiet, legal, binding. Ethan had known. He had known about Amelia for years. He had even supported efforts to keep her existence from Alara, afraid it might distract her from his carefully crafted image of control. I think he paid your mother, Amelia said softly, to stay silent. There's no proof of that part, but the timing, the language. It's clear he was involved. Alara sat back, the world tilting. Ethan hadn't just humiliated her, he had robbed her of a sister, a whole piece of her life kept in the dark, hidden, manipulated, not for protection, but for power. She wasn't angry, she was heartbroken. But then, something remarkable happened. She took a breath, and she let it go. I'm not going back to war, she whispered. That man, he doesn't get another inch of my heart. Amelia looked at her, eyes wide. You're not furious. Oh, I am, Alara said. But I've spent enough years carrying other people's shadows. I'm done. I'd rather carry love. That night, Alara wrote Ethan one last letter. Short, simple. I know what you did. I forgive you, and I release you completely. You no longer live in my story. I've moved into a better one. Elaroshi didn't mail it. She burned it in the fire pit beside Caleb, watching the ashes swirl into the sea-salted air. And then she turned to him and said, I don't want to just survive anymore. I want to live. And he smiled, brushing paint from her cheek. You already are. The wind was warmer now, and the days stretched longer. Elara's studio bloomed. With light, summer brought new faces to the lighthouse. Women traveling from across the country just to attend her workshops. Her bond with Amelia had only grown stronger, sisters, making up for lost time, exchanging years in stories, laughter, and late-night talks over tea. Caleb was always nearby, not as a shadow, but as a steady light. He never tried to outshine her. He supported her quietly, celebrated her loudly, and protected her peace as if it were his own. Their relationship had become something rare, to whole people choosing each other, not out of need, but from love, calm, grounded, deep. Until the day everything changed. It started with a wave of nausea. Alara brushed it off at first, maybe too much sun, or stress from organizing her new art and healing retreat, but it returned, day after day, morning after morning. She ignored it for a while, until one afternoon, after nearly fainting, during a class, Amelia pulled her aside. You need to see someone, she said gently. You don't look well. I'm just tired, Alara insisted, but Caleb saw it, the shadows under her eyes, the way she held her stomach, the quiet moments where her body seemed to tremble with something unspoken at his insistence. She went to the clinic. She expected a warning about rest, maybe an iron deficiency, stress, at worst, but nothing could have prepared her for the nurse's soft smile, and the quiet words that followed. Alara, you're pregnant. The world seemed to still. Pregnant at 41, with everything behind her. The divorce, the rebuilding, the years of silence now. She sat in her car for almost an hour, staring at the steering wheel, trying to breathe. When she finally told Caleb that evening, her voice trembled. I didn't think this was still possible. I never planned for it. I don't even know if I want this. He didn't speak right away. His eyes were wide with shock but not fear. He reached for her hand. Alara, he said gently, whatever we decide, we'll face it together. You're not alone. That night, neither of them slept much. Not out of panic, but because their minds were full of what-ifs. Alara had built a new life she finally loved. She had found herself. Would a child now change everything? Would she lose herself again? But over the next few days, something began to shift. She started painting again, but differently this time. Softer, more fluid. She painted round shapes, growing branches, and warm golds and earth tones. There was a quiet tenderness in her strokes she hadn't felt before. Amelia noticed. You're already falling in love, she said with a smile. I'm terrified. Alara whispered. That's how you know it's real. Elara's pregnancy became a secret garden. She told only those closest to her, Amelia, Caleb, her closest students. The news felt sacred, private, a little miracle she hadn't expected, but slowly began to cherish. Caleb, who had never imagined fatherhood after his own losses, began reading books, preparing meals, researching safe paints and organic everything. He never smothered her, never treated her like she was fragile, but he was always there, present in the quiet ways that mattered most. One evening, as they sat by the water, Alara resting against him, her hand on her growing belly, she said, Used to think I was done starting over. He smiled. You're not starting over, you're growing forward. But as the second trimester arrived, So did complications, sharp pains, bleeding, fear, a rushed trip to the hospital. Alara lay in the sterile white bed, staring at the ceiling, her heart pounding. Caleb held her hand tightly, refusing to let go. Doctor came in with a quiet look and careful words. "You may lose the baby," she said gently. "We're doing everything we can, but the next few days will be critical." Alara nodded, not in panic, not in tears, but in a calm acceptance only a woman who has rebuilt herself from ashes could hold. "I've survived worse," she whispered. "But I want this. I really do." Caleb kissed her knuckles. "Then so do I." She stayed in bed for a week, the studio running under Amelia's care, her students sending notes and drawings of support. The town, who had grown to love Alara as their own, lit candles in their windows at night, silent prayers, soft hopes. And one early morning, after a restless sleep, the doctor came in smiling. "The baby's strong," she said. "So are you. You're going to be okay." In the months that followed, Alara rested more. She slowed down, trusted others, allowed herself to be held, not just by Caleb, but by the life she had built with her own hands. Her final trimester was filled with light crib building, story writing, belly laughter and baby kicks, and late night nursery painting with Caleb. And then, in the quiet hours of a rainy September night, their daughter Leora was born. Her name meant my light, because that's exactly what she was, a gentle, glowing, unexpected light. At the end of a long, broken road, Alara held her close, eyes full of wonder. Caleb stood beside her, eyes full of tears. "She's perfect," he whispered. Alara looked down at their daughter, then up at the man who had walked beside her through every storm. "I didn't think I'd ever have this," she said. "Not again, not in this way." He kissed her softly. "You earned it, Alara, all of it." And so her story continued, not with an ending, but with a new beginning. Not the one she had planned, but the one life had quietly saved for her. A story of pain turned to purpose, of kindness turned to family, and of a woman who was once silenced, now singing lullabies to a child she never knew her heart had room for. Motherhood didn't arrive like a fairy tale. It came softly, like dawn, quiet cries at 3 a.m., tiny socks that never stayed on, the ache of sleepless nights, and the wonder of small fingers curling around hers. Alara had never imagined herself as a mother again, not after everything. But when she looked into Leora's wide, curious eyes, something deep inside her shifted. Child was hers, not just by birth, but by soul. At first she was scared, not of the baby, but of who she'd have to become to raise her. Would she lose herself again? Would she disappear into someone else's needs, like before? But something was different this time. She was different. This time, she had boundaries, a voice, a family who honored her limits and needs. Caleb never let her fade, not even when the days blurred into endless feeding and rocking. He stood beside her, holding her up in ways that didn't demand her strength, but reminded her it was okay to lean. One night, when the baby had finally fallen asleep in Alara's arms, she whispered to him in the dim glow of the nursery, "I used to think motherhood would break me, but this is making me whole." He kissed her temple. "That's because you're doing it your way." As Leora grew, so did Elara's confidence. She wasn't the loud, perfect, Pinterest-style mum. She didn't bake themed cupcakes or post curated pictures online. But she was present. She brought Leora into the studio, setting her in a quiet corner with finger paints and soft music. Clients who came to the lighthouse found comfort in the sight of a mother who didn't hide her child, but welcomed her into the healing space with joy. Sometimes, while teaching, Alara would pause to nurse her baby or hold her on her hip as she spoke to a group of women about starting over, trusting again, finding light. Leora became part of the rhythm, a heartbeat in the background of everything Alara did. Caleb called them his two lights, and he meant it. But motherhood also brought old fears to the surface. One evening, while rocking Leora to sleep, Alara stared out the window at the rising moon. A familiar fear crept in. "What if I mess this up?" she asked softly.